Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video I'm back with another game retrospective here for the 10-year anniversary of the sequel to one of my all-time favorite games. I'll be talking about my thoughts on Season 2 of Telltale's The Walking Dead, which, as I've already talked about numerous times on this channel, I absolutely adored Season 1 of The Walking Dead. I've obviously already done a near 2-hour video on Season 1, and because of that I was super hyped coming into Season 2, it being one of my most anticipated games at the time, and I came out of it being largely underwhelmed. Now, I've grown on aspects of the game since then, but I do still largely remain mixed on my opinions of Season 2, with straight up my opinions probably even going further down over my last replay, where a lot of that comes from the fact that the narrative really just feels like a mess, kind of lacking a focus. And while I think there are arguments to defend some of the decisions that were made, really a lot of it just seems to stem from all these development issues that we've heard that came from this game, of them changing major aspects of the story mid-development, and through that it just makes the entire story just feel largely disjointed, having this massive shift in quality from the first half of the season to the second half. While gameplay-wise it largely sticks to the Telltale formula with very few innovations, and even those really don't have any true depth to them. So clearly I don't have as much reverence for this game as I do with Season 1, but again, I still enjoy aspects of this game. I do think there are great concepts in this game, and seeing the continuation of Clementine's story still makes this a worthwhile experience, despite it also being an extremely messy one, and it not really living up to what I would have personally wanted from it. With that, like my other retrospective, I'll be running through the game from beginning to end, talking about my opinions along the way. And with that, let's start off with Episode 1, All That Remains. A decent intro to the season for what it is. Again, I do have initial disappointments from it, and the fact that it almost instantly disconnects itself from where we left off in the previous season, though it still does have a strong focus on Clementine, where obviously the choice to transition to Clementine as the protagonist here is one that was very interesting on paper, where again, obviously in the first game you play as Lee Everett, and you take care of Clementine. However, now you play as the character that you protected the first time around, with it kind of feeling like this passing of the torch, having Lee teach Clementine these aspects of the world that we see her utilize this experience throughout this season. While I do think this is still the most satisfying way to continue on with the story, I do question, especially now years out from this game's original release, if it was necessary. I feel like to me at this point, I kind of feel like we probably would have been better off had Season 1 just remained its own individual story, as I really feel like nothing really matches up to that quality after the fact. And I think by the end of this season, I really feel like this was a story that didn't really need to be told. With that, again, let's run through the events of the episode, where you start off the episode 8 months after the ending of Season 1, where you see Clementine traveling with Omid and a pregnant Krista, obviously these two figures that we saw in the post-credit scene at the end of Season 1, obviously confirming the theories that it was Omid and Krista the entire time. Though, like a lot of this game, this connective tissue between seasons really doesn't lead to anything. Though here we do see them stopping by Gil's pit stop, obviously the location from 400 Days, so that's another reference for you. But here we pretty abruptly get to play as Clementine as she enters the bathroom, to which we have to check the bathroom to see if it's safe, being our first bit of gameplay there. Though following this, she ends up putting her gun down on the sink as she begins to clean herself, only for her to drop a bottle of water and having to head to the stall to retrieve it. During which, again, there is a nice little callback here to Season 1, where she will either curse or not based on if Lee did back at Herschel's farm. But anyway, as she does this, a stranger ends up walking in, but here we see her picking up Clem's gun, during which we see Omid entering the room, preparing to sneak up on the stranger, only for the door to close loudly because I guess Omid didn't think that through, to which the stranger ends up killing Omid in her panic, being a really sad death for Omid here, being this really fun character from Season 1, and again, him being added to this game simply to just die right away. And while I can get this decision in terms of setting the tone for the game, which again, straight up, this game is extremely dark, I do still find it kind of underwhelming that they didn't do more with Omid here, with it really just feeling like he was killed here to be this shocking death early on. But obviously with that, we have Krista then appearing to kill the stranger herself, cutting us to 16 months later, where now Clementine has gotten slightly older, and we see a no longer pregnant Krista, which with no mention of the baby, adding to the really dark tone here as they're cooking a weasel on a campfire, which again feels a bit OTT. But the mood here is extremely solemn, with Krista clearly having blamed Clem for Omid's death due to her being careless and leaving the gun on the sink. But it does also make you question, like, was Krista literally being this way for 16 months, which does feel kind of ridiculous, that Clem even stayed with her, despite her clearly being distant to her. But either way, this is where Krista does mention that they are heading towards Wellington, a safe zone up north, which ends up being the end goal for this game, kind of, which I think is another criticism of this game as a whole to me, is, again, its lack of focus. I do feel like there's a lack of clear character motivations for a lot of the events that go on here, where it really feels like these characters are simply just surviving and moving along for the sake of it, more so than them having an actual goal. So again, I feel like this lack of true focus here really does take away from the story in my mind, with it just feeling like things are constantly happening with no real purpose to a lot of it. But either way, eventually Krista ends up getting firewood, to which Clem is tasked with tending the fire, to which you have to search through her backpack to find the lighter, and in doing so you end up finding the photo of Lee from Everett Pharmacy, which is a nice little callback there, and her also being unable to bring herself to burning it, which shows you the love she still has for Lee. Also her finding a drawing of Kenny's family, which I wonder if that'll be somewhat relevant. But eventually Krista ends up coming back, being held at gunpoint by two bandits, with us now having the choice of sneaking away or trying to distract them, a choice that doesn't matter at all, which straight up, most choices in this game are that. Which is a common criticism of Telltale games as a whole, is how your choices don't really matter. However, I never realized how much your choices really don't matter in Season 2 here. Or in Season 1, again, they didn't matter in the sense that, yeah, that you would get back to the same point eventually. However, I did feel like there was a lot more deviation and things that could possibly happen in Season 1. While in Season 2, there's a lot of choices like this where it's literally you making the choice, and then no matter which you pick, the same event happens instantly, instead of there at least being some deviation here, where again, whether you choose to sneak away or you try to distract them, either way you get caught and you have to go into this chase sequence. Obviously being our first action sequence in the game, and also introduction to some of the new QuickTime events in the game, though again they're just like what you would expect. By the way, it all ends with Clementine falling into a nearby river and passing out, to which we end up never seeing Krista ever again, which is strange and just feels like another really underdeveloped plot thread, one that was probably going to be followed up on, but due to the troubles with development they just never ended up getting to that point. But it's also strange to me that they never follow up on this beyond this season, where considering like the later appearance of Lily in the series, like it just feels weird to me that they never bothered to fully explain what happened to Krista. Either way, the story continues the next morning, where Clem awakens on the riverbank, to which we end up having a lengthy section here of Clem being alone. Obviously continuing this dark tone of her having now lost the two people that she trusted from the end of the previous season, and now has to fend for herself. And again, as I mentioned before, the game as a whole does have this extremely dark tone to it being almost a constant negative trajectory for Clem and her later friends. It never really feeling like there is a true high point across the entire story, which I actually don't fully mind. I mean, while again it is a massive departure from Season 1, which again was dark for sure, but again it did feel like there were at least these moments of levity and points where it did feel like the group had some hope, while it feels like this season is largely devoid of hope, which kind of adds to the uniqueness of the story, though in ways I do feel like the constant death of characters kind of loses its meaning by the end, with these characters just feeling like they're on this revolving door, and it's not really helped by the fact that most of the characters don't come off as likable to begin with. But anyway, we get our first explorable area in the game here, where we do end up finding a campsite, to which we end up encountering a dog, which ends up being a nice companion here right off the bat, again making you think that Clem has found a new friend, only for it to obviously not turn out that way. But here we end up having to find some food, which ends up being a can of beans that she finds in the trash, which makes you question, why is this full can of beans in the trash? But also has you killing a walker to get a pocket knife to open the can, during which she ends up remembering Lee's advice, which is a nice little moment. Though either way, after opening the food, the dog ends up begging for some, to which you can choose to feed it or not, only for the dog to attack you anyway, because again, that's this game. And this leads to this action sequence where you do have to fight the dog, leading to it eventually getting impaled, which is obviously this really sad moment there, which just the squealing from the dog here is just really haunting. But here you are given the choice of putting him down or leaving him to die, which none of these choices matter either. By the way, with her getting bit on the arm, she now continues on wounded, to which she gets surrounded by walkers, only for her to be saved by two new strangers. These two being Luke and Pete. They're end up carrying Clem off back to their camp, only to then realize that she's been bit. To which she obviously tells them it's a dog bite, though they remain skeptical. However, Pete instantly comes off as a likable character here, saying that he refuses to leave her to die and plans on taking her to the group's doctor. Though either way, Clem ends up passing out, only to be awakened by this new group arguing over what to do with her. With our first sight is Nick pointing a rifle directly at her, which is a pretty apt introduction to Nick, who essentially comes off as this season's Ben, this guy that's trying to do the right thing. Everything he does seemingly blows up in his face. But either way, this all leads up to an argument over the origin of the bite, to which Carlos, the doctor, is unsure of the bite's origins because I guess he can't tell the difference between a dog bite and a human bite. But here we are given another choice of we can pick a single group member to try to convince to help us in the argument, only for it to not matter once again. Either way, the group ends up deciding to leave Clem overnight in a shed to make sure that she isn't bit, which again, I understand obviously if they don't know that's a dog bite, which again, how does Carlos not know, that they do want to obviously be cautious and not let her in, especially considering the mentioning a recent incident, though this is just such an unlikable introduction to this new group of characters, all of which outside of Pete and I guess Luke have a really terrible first impression here, which is kind of the issue with this game, is that very few of the new characters in this game come off as likable, which makes it very difficult to care about them, and especially considering this revolving door of them with characters being killed left and right, it really just makes it a struggle to really care about much of what's going on outside of what's happening to Clem herself for most of the story. By the way, this ends up leading up to a pretty lengthy gameplay section here of us having to sneak out of the shed and sneak into the cabin to get supplies so Clem can treat herself, which has us instantly finding a board blocking a hole at the bottom of the shed, which we break open with a hammer, which all feels extremely convenient that they left a hammer for us inside, and that there also is this massive hole for her to exit through. By the way, we end up sneaking up to the cabin, where the way to enter is through going underneath the patio and going through a trap door, though there's another way to get supplies here that I kind of forgot was even a possibility until my latest playthrough, and that is the fact that you can go up to one of the windows, to which you'll find Alvin, another one of the more likable figures in this game, to where he will end up getting supplies for you. Mind you, he'll be extremely hesitant about it, and really that's kind of the negatives about Alvin, is the fact that he does come off as a largely feckless character, though again, the option to have him help you out here is pretty nice. So either way, once inside, you can also eavesdrop on the group meeting that's going on, but upstairs you can find the supplies you need, going through the numerous bedrooms and a bathroom to where you can find rags and a needle. But once you find items in the bathroom, you do end up having to hide as you hear Rebecca enter the room, to which she will say to herself that she's worried about the identity of her baby's father, which is obviously foreshadowing there. Either way, heading into another one of the bedrooms, you do end up finding Sarah, Carlos's daughter, a teenage girl, actually older than Clementine, despite the fact that she is extremely sheltered, kind of showing this what if for Clementine, of what if Lee didn't teach her the realities of the world and just continued to shelter her. And through that can lead to some annoyances with Sarah, where I know there is a large consensus that does find Sarah really annoying as a character, with her seemingly just causing problems constantly. Though I've always found her to be a somewhat interesting character, and obviously being this very different character from what you would typically see in a zombie apocalypse, so also makes you question how has Carlos been able to shelter her for this long, to where she literally knows nothing about what's going on outside. But either way, she does have a nice intro here of her just wanting to be Clem's friend and offers to help her, to which she ends up giving her some peroxide. So again, nice introduction for her. But with all the supplies, we end up returning back to the shed, to which Clem has to disinfect her wounds, which leaves her screaming in pain. And then she uses fishing wire and a needle to stitch up the wound, all of which being this pretty brutal scene, especially seeing this kid having to do this operation on herself. But eventually Clem ends up dropping the rags, to which, when grabbing it, she gets attacked by a walker for some reason, obviously leading to a fight sequence here that does mirror Lee's fight with the babysitter back in season 1, even in the way that Clem ends up killing it with her hammer, but still feels like a section here that is largely unnecessary, though I guess it's utilized to bring the group out to where they obviously hear the commotion, and their first instinct, over apologizing at the danger that they just put her through, is to then argue over her stealing supplies and condemning her, which again makes this group seem very likable. unlikable. But either way, they do end up letting Clem into the cabin, to which she gets bandaged up by Carlos, giving a nice introduction to him, to which he now states that, okay, now I know that you were bit by a dog, which again, why do you know just now? But Carlos is kind of just a mixed character for me. Again, one that does have a lot of unlikable moments in the game, that does seem like a mostly kind-hearted guy, and a guy that has some sprinkles of wisdom at points, though one that I just really did not connect with too much though. But beyond this, we end up meeting the rest of the group, which largely ends up feeling like this really forced scene of essentially every other member of the group having some sort of interaction with Clementine as she's eating dinner, which I find funny. But first we start off with Luke, who is the one that ends up feeding her here, and Luke largely comes off as a really nice character here, being the longest surviving member of these cabin survivors, and being one that is clearly being set up to be the most important of the bunch, seeming to have this brother-sister style relationship with Clem here, and them opening up to each other about their backgrounds, with Clem being able to mention Lee here. Well, then we have Nick entering the room, who ends up stumbling through his apology, to which you can accept it or not, which these choices again don't matter too much. I'm refusing it leads to Nick storming out of the room, and Clem saying that she wants to stay away from crazy people like him, which I will say is not a great characterization of Clem, which I will say there are a number of dialogue options and choices in this game that do kind of make Clem come off as a dick like she does here, which I don't particularly love, though accepting the apology does lead to Nick opening up about his mistrust of her, and it coming from having lost his mother to them welcoming in an infected survivor, which is a nice background on his character. Though after this, we then have Pete entering the room, to which he tells Clem that he'll be checking out the fish traps in the morning and wants her to come along, which we obviously end up agreeing to, which again, Pete largely comes off as a largely likable character here, but one that was clearly set up to die, as why else would he be set up as this likable of a character? Again, it feeling like he was being set up to be the shocking death for down the road. And the final character we end up interacting with here is Rebecca, who sucks. Where I really hated Rebecca during my original playthroughs, and I still don't particularly like her. Now again, she comes off extremely unlikable, the Clem being upset that she's still there and being upset that they're wasting food on her, to which then Clem can blackmail her with the information about her baby's father, which is just a weird moment from Clem as well. But again, Rebecca just comes off so unlikable early on here, and while she does warm up to Clem as the story progresses, it doesn't really feel earned. It really just feels like it's happening just because the writer said so, they're not feeling like there's much substance to why her character changes. But either way, next morning we do have Clem and Pete going off into the woods, to where they are joined by Nick, and as they arrive at the river, they're shocked to find some fresh corpses along the bank, one of which is Roman from 400 Days, which is funny, as in essence it connects Roman and his group to this group of bandits, these bandits that turn out to be the group that end up attacking Clem and Krista, which is a nice connective piece here, though one that doesn't really do much outside of, I guess, setting up the threat that Carver poses, as Pete does make offhand mention that Carver being the one responsible for this, obviously being the later antagonistic figure that we see in the following episode, though again, this showing that Carver is someone that is able to defeat these bandits that Clem wasn't really able to, and through that ends up heightening his threat level. But either way, we have an investigation section where during which Clem ends up finding her backpack next to one of the bodies, obviously confirming that this is the group that attacked her and Krista, though when asking one of the survivors here about Krista, he knows nothing about her, because that's every time you ask about Krista. Though here we have a really pointless choice of being able to give him water or not that has no real effect on anything. But it is here where we do see that walkers end up approaching, and both Pete and Nick end up getting attacked, with Pete even getting bitten in the leg, which came very abruptly here, even considering the fact that I think you could have easily expected that he was going to die at some point down the road. But through that, we are given the final choice that ends the episode, having to pick which of the two to save here, essentially being the first choice of consequence in this episode, a moment that's clearly trying to mimic that of the Carly and Doug choice of having to pick between these two characters, though does it in a way that isn't nearly as impactful, considering the fact that we just saw Pete get bit, and through that he's more than likely going to die anyway. All while also the choice itself not ending up mattering anyway, as Pete dies no matter what, and Nick ends up surviving no matter what. So again, a pretty pointless choice by the end of it. Though if you do end up helping Nick here, he ends up scolding you for not helping Pete, and Pete will die here in this moment, while picking Pete will have you escaping with Pete, while Nick runs into the woods alone. A very strange ending to this episode, where this is another thing that the season does quite often, of it having a pretty massive cliffhanger ending, of it having you make a choice at the very end, and you seeing the ramifications of that in the following episode. A really terrible plot device in my mind, where one, in the fact that obviously it breaks up these scenes to make them less suspenseful, but even beyond that, I do feel like it leads to this lack of finality in these episodes, where I think something that's so great about Walking Dead Season 1 is the fact that each episode feels like its own self-contained story. It feels like there's, again, this focus within each of the episodes and the stories that they attempt to tell, while it feels like Season 2 here just feels like these random events that just so happen to happen in each episode. It doesn't feel like there's this main focus for every episode. As even here in this episode, there's so many things that happen. There's Omid's death, you have the separation from Krista, you have Clem alone, and then her with the dog, and then her being rescued by Luke and Pete, and then her being put in the shed, and her sneaking to the house, and then her meeting the group, and now the events of the riverbank. And all this feels like there's no real purpose to any of this. Like there's no end goal that each episode is striving for. There's no real purpose to these events actually occurring. They're just happening. And through that, it just makes the overall episodic nature of the game feel largely pointless, feeling like it was done not because it actually enhances the overall experience, feeling like it was clearly done so more so because the game wasn't finished and for budgetary reasons, which again, straight up is the reason why episodic games are made. Though I do think there are games that are able to utilize their episodic nature and enhance the story through its episodic nature, which I do think Season 1 did. Season 2 here, again, simply doesn't. By the way, with that, we do move on to Episode 2, House Divided, a pretty strong follow-up on Episode 1, where again, it just continues off right where we left off and us getting to know more of these characters. And while again, most of them still come off as pretty unlikable, it does add more depth to the story while also introducing us to the best villain in the history of the series. Also reintroducing some characters from the past, that leads this being a pretty jam-packed episode, one that it feels like a lot is happening here. Though despite that, it ends up feeling like one of the more focused episodes of the bunch, and really being the only episode outside of obviously the final one to not end in the middle of an action sequence. But anyway, the episode does start with Clem being stuck inside of either a shed or a truck, being surrounded by walkers. Which one you're in is decided on which character you saved in the previous episode. Wherever you saved Nick, the two will end up spending the night in the shed. This ends up being a nice bonding moment between the two characters here, with Clem having to convince him to leave, with Nick just kind of moping around, which again is initially kind of frustrating, though once you contextualize the fact that he just lost his mom and also his uncle and Pete, you can kind of start to see why his headspace is in that way. Though otherwise, if you did end up picking to save Pete, the two of you will spend the night in a truck instead, which I don't get why this is different, but Pete's condition will end up getting worse, where you do get some nice moments between them two, with you talking about his impending death, and you do end up promising to look after Nick for him, which doesn't work out too well. Though either way, the story continues through escaping from a group of walkers to where you reach the cabin, where there you find Carlos and Rebecca, who reveal that the others have gone searching for Clem's group, to which now hearing about Pete having gotten bitten, they decide to now go out and search on their own for some reason. Again, this makes no sense, especially considering Rebecca's pregnancy and everything. It does feel really stupid that they go out searching while Clem is now stuck in the house. By the way, Clem is told to look after Sarah, leading to us finding Sarah playing around with a camera she's been taking photos with. This can lead up to a pretty nice moment of us teaching Sarah how to use a gun, really showing what Clem has learned from Lee. It also feels kind of weird as none of this really has any true impact on Sarah as a character. By the way, they end up noticing someone downstairs, to which Sarah ends up having a panic attack when seeing who it is, with now Clem being given the choice of opening the door or locking the door, which doesn't matter anyway, as the man will barge in anyway. With the man here not being named, though obviously we clearly find out that he's Carver, the main antagonist of this and the following episode. Again, probably the best villain that the Walking Dead series has had, being this really menacing foil for the group here, that has this really twisted background, while also truly believing in his convictions, and also being brilliantly portrayed by Michael Madsen, who is a pretty big get for a Telltale game here. I believe it is the casting of Michael Madsen that did make them really expand the role of Carver, where it was initially going to be a smaller scaled villain, and while he technically is still only in 2 of the 5 episodes, he still ends up having a pretty major impact on this season. So anyway, Carver ends up snooping around the cabin here, clearly searching for the group, to which he ends up seeing a photo that Sarah took on the floor, clearly knowing that the group had been here, though I do find it really dumb that he doesn't actually do anything here, as why is he actually actually go into the house just to then retreat and then just follow them for a few days? Like, couldn't he have just easily kidnapped them? But either way, all a really great introduction to Carver, this really tense scene of him clearly looking for something here and us being able to lie to him about not knowing the group. Though also, we get this really strange parting words from him and him telling us to not trust the group, which makes you think that, oh, there's probably a reason for this, only for us to find out that no, this is just a really pointless throwaway line. But anyway, the group ends up returning and end up revealing that was Carver. Who would have guessed? But here Sarah will reveal that he saw the photo of her, to which you end up getting a decision on who gets the blame for this, where Clem can blame herself for this, or you can blame Carlos, or you can blame Sarah, all of which doesn't really matter, as either way the group ends up packing up and leaving, to which the rest of this episode is us being on the run from Carver, which again does add a level of focus to this episode. I do like that the rest of this episode is us trying to run away from Carver, only for us to be captured by him by the end. It feels like there is this concurrent plot thread throughout the entire episode that simply isn't there for many other episodes. But anyway, as we leave the cabin, we do see Rebecca apologizing to Clem, to which she starts being nicer to her from this point forward, which again, not explained why. Also, we'll see the group end up stumbling upon the location where we left Nick or Pete, to which if you went with Nick, this is where Nick will end up rejoining the group, being alive no matter what you choose, while otherwise they'll obviously just find Pete dead, which is obviously just a really sad death for him. But anyway, we then cut 5 days later as the group ends up arriving at a bridge with a lodge on the other side, to which Clem and Luke are tasked with clearing the path, but there being some hesitancy for Clem to be doing this as she is a kid, which again makes a lot of sense, and does make you question just in general, why is Clem doing a lot of these things? Where that is a pretty dumb aspect of a lot of this story, is how contrived it is that Clementine is the one that has to do all of these action sequences or heist missions when there's other adults here that could clearly be doing it as well. Now obviously the answer is simply because she's the main character. However, that is a dumb explanation from a narrative perspective, as it doesn't make any true logical sense for her to be doing things like this, though she is obviously capable of doing so. And we do get a pretty lengthy action sequence here of killing the walkers, but afterwards the duo ends up coming across a man with a rifle who ends up asking them questions, coming off as intimidating at first, though he does end up being friendly and offers them some food, only for Nick to then appear from behind and shoots and kills him for no reason, which is a bizarre thing that Nick does here. Now, again, I think there is some explanation here in the fact that, again, Nick had just lost his mom and uncle, and maybe he was under the impression that, oh, this guy's gonna kill my friends, I don't want to lose more people, and through that was being extremely protective here. But it's still a dumb decision, one that could potentially haunt him moving forward. Anyway, after crossing the bridge here, we end up finding a safe house, to which we are tasked by Alvin, find some food for Rebecca, during which we find a knife that was owned by the guy we killed, and through that open a chest where we find a can of food, all feeling like kind of a contrived way of adding this knife to the story, which has later ramifications, though again also does add some nice interactions between Clem and Alvin here, even though that stuff doesn't really matter. Either way, we have the group then arriving at the ski resort, to which they end up finding it reinforced and are later confronted by its inhabitants, with this obviously being a very notable scene, with Clem hearing the arguing from the background, with one of the voices sounding eerily familiar, to which we obviously get the reveal that this is a group led by Kenny, who is obviously a major character in season 1, where obviously season 1 ends in a way that makes you think that Kenny had died, though it was always not super clear cut to where, again, it felt pretty apparent that they were going to bring him back for season 2. Though again, a nice callback here. Again, one of the biggest aspects of season 1 that does carry over into season 2. But through this, we get this nice reunion scene between the two, with Clem being shocked that Kenny's still alive, though at the same time, this is also really stupid. Again, it implies that Clem and Kenny had this extremely close relationship and had a lot of care for each other when we've barely ever seen the two interact at all in season 1. I mean, we've seen maybe like what, 1 or 2 interactions between the two, like really nothing of substance. And the fact that the story wants you to believe that Kenny and Clem are extremely close is just so stupid to me. And again, it feels like it tricking you into thinking that this was a relationship the entire time, simply because obviously the player has a connection to Kenny through the player's connection to Lee. However, that connection doesn't actually translate to Clementine. So again, from an actual narrative perspective, I do find all this really stupid stupid, but again, it is nice to see Kenny back here, and I do really like what they do with Kenny on this season. His character being one of the only things I actually like in episodes 4 and 5, though interestingly, the initial plan for Kenny's role in this season was very different in the fact that initially he was going to be the Carver figure, where he was meant to be the main antagonist of season 2. And while in a way he still is, and they do very much add in these Carver parallels for Kenny by the end of the season, I do think it would have been interesting if we did get that initial concept, though I really don't know how well it would have worked out in execution, especially considering, again, I do feel like just the lack of connection between Clementine and Kenny would kind of nullify a lot of the impact of that, where I feel like what makes Kenny's character work so well in this season is that we do get to see the bond between Clem and Kenny throughout this season, to where while again it wasn't in season 1, there's so much focus on it in season 2 to where you feel that bond grow. However, if that's not as much there and Kenny's just simply this antagonistic figure for the entirety of season 2, I do feel like it would have made his character a lot less impactful. So I do feel like this is actually a rewrite that actually probably benefited the season as a whole. But anyway, obviously Kenny ends up letting the group in here, where you do end up catching up with him and obviously tell him about what happened to Lee and Krista. You also do end up meeting the other members of his group, his new girlfriend in Sarita, who is largely a pretty bland character in my mind. Her just feeling like another version of Katya and this other like motherly figure that Clem can bond with. But also you have Walter, a really happy-go-lucky presence here, though one that does have a pretty interesting role moving forward. Either way, we can explore the lodge here and do end up helping Sarita and Sarah and hanging up some Christmas ornaments, during which you can talk to Rebecca about her baby, or talk to Walter, to which he'll mention his partner in Matthew, who might come up later down the road. But eventually dinner is served, and you do get one of the more difficult choices in the entire game here. Again, one that doesn't end up mattering really at all, but is a choice here of picking which table to sit at between Kenny's group or the cabin group. One that I do think is a pretty tough decision, as I personally, again, really enjoy Kenny's character, and I instinctively want to side with Kenny here, especially considering the cabin group does come off as largely unlikable for the most part. However, again, Luke does come off as a very likable character, and really that is the main dilemma of this season, is this Kenny versus Luke dynamic. This dynamic that was clearly meant to last the entire season, though again feels like another plot thread that is simply just dropped for almost no reason, and I think it really does harm the overall consistency of the story moving forward, and how Luke as a character was clearly set up to be much more important in the story than what he ends up being. But no matter what side you end up picking, the other ends up joining the other table anyway, because that's this game for you, which leads to a bit of a strange interaction here, and Kenny calling Luke and Nick a match, and through that they're insulted by this, and it all feels like kind of homophobic in that light. Though we also have Kenny calling Nick Vanilla Ice, which I don't even know where he got that from. Again, all this is just a very strange scene here, though eventually Kenny does mention that his end goal is to eventually reach Wellington, which again, if we stick with Kenny throughout the entire story, that is where we eventually go. Though again, it just very much feels like an afterthought, where it literally isn't mentioned again until the final episode after this point. Though at the same time, does show that Yor and Kenny's interests align here, especially as the others don't seem to be as on board with this plan for some reason, again, not really explain why, seeming like they are just simply to be in contrast to Kenny, which happens a lot in this game, of other characters making weird decisions that are the opposite of Kenny, that seem to just be there to try to emphasize Kenny as not being good for the group, when a lot of it just feels extremely heavy-handed. Though this all leads to a really funny moment to me, of one that's clearly being meant to be a really dramatic moment, of Kenny accidentally calling Clem Duck, obviously a reference to his son in season 1, but one that the overall writing here just again feels extremely heavy-handed to me, to where it just kind of comes off as humorous instead. But anyway, the story ends up progressing through Clem talking to Walter outside, to which he talks about his positive outlook on the world, directly leading into us seeing a woman peering into the resort. If you've played 400 Days, you'd clearly recognize right away as Bonnie, though here she comes off as someone that is looking for help, to which Walter instantly gives her a box of food to feed her family, again showing his kind-hearted nature, something that ends up directly backfiring on him. But once we get back to the house, though, we do see Luke pulling Clem aside, with him having recognized that the man that they saw on the bridge is actually Walter's partner, Matthew. leading to us now talking about having to stop Nick and Walter from finding out, to which Nick will then join the conversation very conveniently, to which you are then given the choice of telling Nick about Matthew, which doesn't really affect that much, along with the fact that you are then given the task of retrieving Matthew's knife that again you found in the safe house earlier and hiding it so that Walter doesn't find out, only for you to then go and get it from your bag, only to then literally see Walter already looking at it in the distance while he's outside, which is just so stupid. It feels extremely contrived. And like, how did Walter get this knife? Like, they literally just rummaged through Clem's bag, and even beyond that, just the concept of it is literally in this moment that Clem ends up seeing him as he's looking at the knife is all really stupid as well. But either way, Clem ends up talking to him, and we end up telling him what happened to Matthew, though interestingly, his response here is to ask if Nick is a good man, which essentially your response to this will end up directly affecting whether or not Walter kills Nick down the road, which does have an effect obviously on the season moving forward, where if Nick does not die in this episode, then he will later die in episode 4, though he also just plays like such a minor role in episode 3 to where obviously that is a ramification of him being an optional character in that episode anyway, which makes the overall impact of this choice here not feel nearly as impactful. But anyway, before Walter can interact with Nick here, we have the windmills conveniently breaking down, and that leads to a massive action sequence of us having to fight off some walkers, to which we end up seeing Nick struggling with the walker, and again, depending on your choices, this is where Walter will either choose to save him or let him get eaten, which could be the end of Nick's story, though either way, the walkers end up being killed off by a group that approaches them, killing them all with assault rifles, with us now seeing that the group is fronted by Carver, who is there alongside Bonnie, revealing that Bonnie is working for him, and also in turn revealing that the 400 Days group had joined Carver's community, which feels really stupid considering the setup to the 400 Days group, which again we'll talk about, and really just all the connective tissue between this season and 400 Days is pretty dumb. But anyway, we instantly see Carver coming off as really menacing here, instantly beating up Carlos and ordering everyone inside, lining them up as if they're about to be executed, to where we do see Clem being able to hide from him alongside Alvin and Rebecca, where we are given the choice of surrendering to Carver or going off to search for Kenny, both of which choices don't really matter, as essentially the same events occur, though the only difference is your perspective of them, as obviously if you surrender, you are there alongside Carver and the rest of the group, while if you go for Kenny, you're obviously with Kenny. Though either way, Kenny will end up sniping down one of Carver's men, leading to Carver getting payback by killing Walter, which ends up being a really abrupt death there, but then threatens to kill another if Kenny continues to shoot, where Carver then picks up Alvin to then kill him, which I question why didn't he go for Alvin to begin with, considering we later learn about his vendetta with Alvin. But either way, we're given some choices here on how to handle the situation, where we can tell Kenny to surrender, or we can even run up to Alvin to try to protect him, to which in doing so he'll be spared, though if Clem remains silent or tells Carver to stop, Kenny will end up shooting, causing Carver to end up killing Alvin in this situation, making Alvin also a character that can die in this episode, though a death that does not feel nearly as impactful as how his death can be handled in the following episode, though either way, Kenny eventually stands down anyway, as the next person he threatens ends up being Clem or Sarita, which kind of makes the Alvin death feel even more pointless in that light. But either way, the episode does end here with the entire group, minus Luke, being captured by Carver, which he says he's taking them home. I think this great cliffhanger for the episode, where again, I mentioned before that I really don't like these endings that end in the middle of these action sequences and after these choices. However, this feels like the most normal ending of an episode of this season, but it is one that still definitely has stakes, still one that does have suspense for the following episode and you wondering how are they going to escape from Carver, but not in a way that makes it feel like it saps away from this episode, where it feels like the overall story of this episode does conclude in a natural way, and you are constantly on the run from Carver in this episode only for you to be captured by the very end. It feels like this solid, consistent storyline that simply isn't there for a lot of the rest of the season, but I think through that does really make this episode stand out, alongside the next episode, which is still probably my favorite episode of the season, that being episode 3, In Harm's Way. An episode that is wholly focused around the group now being captured within Carver's community, and thus ultimately having to create an escape plan and also defeat him. Again, a nice focused story here, but one that does feel a bit early in the story. Again, this feels like this massive turning point for the story, one that could have been the ultimate conclusion of the story. But considering this is only episode 3, I think it does lead to the rest of the season just feeling a bit strange. Again, it leads this downward trajectory in terms of the quality of the season moving forward, where episodes 4 and 5 are not nearly as strong as episodes 1, 2, and 3. I do feel like the lack of stakes and the lack of a true outward threat really leads to those episodes not feeling as impactful as this episode did. But anyway, the episode does start with Clem watching over Sarah, who is taking a bathroom break in the woods, which feels like a kind of pointless scene there outside of it reaffirming the Clem-Sarah relationship, though once they get back, we get this tense interaction between Clem and Carver, with Carver talking on his walkie-talkie and Clem listening in on his conversation, only for him to be upset at her, to which you can talk back or stare back at him, to which in doing so, he will slap her to the ground, which really just adds to the brutality of Carver's character here. But once we get back in the truck, Kenny will be concerned that they hurt Clementine no matter what happened, whether he slapped her or not, which is kind of dumb. But this leads to Kenny wanting to fight back, and this ends up really showing him as hot-headed and irrational, with Carlos telling him to calm down and calls him impulsive and says there are consequences for your rash actions. And all this really feels like blatant setup to Kenny's arc over the next few episodes, though Kenny is once again shown as being an outlier in the group, with most of the group having faith in the fact that Luke will end up saving them, while Kenny obviously thinks that he's abandoned them, once again highlighting this Kenny versus Luke dynamic, though eventually they end up arriving at Carver's camp, which ends up being a hardware store, where Kenny ends up cutting himself free and plans on storming Carver as they open the doors, only for Kenny to fall as the truck stops and hits his face, knocking him out, which is kind of a ridiculous way for this all to conclude. Either way, when the truck opens, we get the first appearance of Tavia in season 2 here. Obviously, this character from 400 Days that recruited all the characters from 400 Days into what we later learn as Carver's group, to which Tavia comes off as a radically different character here than how she did in 400 Days. Where, again, it just feels really strange how they incorporate 400 Days into this episode, with it very much just feeling like a retcon. It very much feels like this was not the original plan for the 400 Days characters, and all of them really end up acting completely opposed to how they acted in the original game. Now, again, there is a line later on that implies that the group used to be more peaceful and that Carver has changed over time, though that doesn't change the fact that, again, it still very much just feels like a change made to accommodate for this new direction, and not initially being their plan to have them to be part of this authoritarian society and for them to all kind of act like dicks across this episode, outside of Bonnie, who instantly does come off as apologetic for what happened at the lodge, though she's really the only character that ends up having any substance to her from the 400 Days crew, considering she's the only character that ends up being one that appears beyond this episode. But anyway, right away we do see Carver literally being this authoritarian figure here, with him overseeing the warehouse from his office on the upper floor, and him talking through a PA system where he calls their community a beacon of hope. And along with Carver's wanting to forgive the group and have them reintegrate, it really makes him come off as this guy having this massive messiah complex. But either way, here we do also see Troy taking Carlos away from the group so that he can help treat some other members of the community, to which Sarah is instantly scared at being separated from him, leading to Clem essentially being her protector figure for the rest of this episode. But anyway, the group is then taken to the pen, a holding area for those that break the rules and those that have to prove their worth to the community, where they end up meeting up with Reggie, an old friend of the group's, who had helped them escape previously, though here they do see him having lost his arm since the last time they saw him, with him revealing that he got bit by a walker and they had to amputate his arm to save him, which is just a weird plot thread they decided to add that. Here's him having survived something that Lee obviously didn't, though also Reggie ends up being voiced by Kumail Nanjiani, who again didn't know who he was at the time this game came out, though interesting that obviously his career skyrocketed years later, and it's just funny that he had a role in a Telltale game here. By the way, Reggie clearly comes off as someone trying to reintegrate himself within the group, telling them that the community's not as bad as that they think, and that Carver is working to build a real community, and that he's going to give them a second chance, and it really just feeling like he's been drinking the Kool-Aid there. But it's also here where if Alvin is alive, that Tavia will end up taking him away from the group. They will end up saying that Carver just wants to speak with him, with Alvin saying that he would have already done something if he intended to hurt him, which is a really bad read there. But it's also while here that we do notice two other survivors in the pen, both of which having pretty rocky introductions here, with Mike being introduced as a guy that's annoyed that they're interrupting his sleep, while the other one is a woman that we later find out to be Jane, who ends up just watching them from a distance. And Reggie ends up saying that she's weird and that she was found outside sneaking around in walker guts, which ends up being a bit of foreshadowing to her future role in the story. Now beyond this, we do have a bit of an exploration section of Kenny and Clem creating a plan on Kenny distracting Reggie while Clem is able to try to find ways to escape, to which you can talk to a number of the other characters, though both Mike and Jane just want to be left alone, which again is a nice way to introduce them. While likes of Rebecca ends up expressing regret over how she's treated Alvin, to which you can reassure her that he knows how much she loves him, which, I mean, I guess. Though anytime you end up interacting with things here, Reggie ends up telling you to stop, which can lead to some humorous lines from him, but eventually Carlos ends up being brought back to the group by Troy, and by continuing your investigation, Troy ends up being disappointed in Reggie from not keeping the people outside in line and tells him he's going to tell Carver about his slip-ups, which implies his rocky standing in the group. Though here we have the group being able to defend him, to which Troy ends up making a racist comment towards Sarita, which is obviously a great way to introduce him as well. But after that, we end up cutting to the next morning, where Clementine is awakened by Troy kicking her in her sleep, which is weird, though we do have Carver later debriefing the group, giving them their assignments for the day, with Sarah trying to talk to Clem as it's happening, to which you can stay quiet or attempt to stop her. Either way, Carver will get annoyed and yell at Carlos for her actions, to which he demands that Carlos disciplines her, telling him to smack her in the face, to which he regretfully does so. Again, once again, just showing how menacing of a villain Carver ends up being here. Though also being this moment that puts Sarah in this state of shock moving forward. But anyway, we have Tavia taking Clem to the armory, where she's going to be working with Bonnie, to which we get our first 400 Days cameo, where on the way we see Xiao and Becca pass her, to which they talk about Sarah being back in the community, and Becca complains about not liking her, which again is a great portrayal of Shell and Becca, which, I mean, in general, obviously we should just talk about the 400 Days cameos here, which are all just really lame. These really short sequences that have no substance on anything. Like, it's really disappointing that that's the effect that 400 Days has on the overall narrative, is the potential of adding 4 different scenes to the main game, each of which being not even 30 seconds in length. All while Bonnie, who is an important character that is introduced in 400 Days, you don't even need 400 Days to fully understand her character, and she never refers to anything that happens in 400 Days anyway. And again, all this is just really disappointing that this is the way they connected 400 Days, especially when all the 400 Days characters come off as dicks here too. Now, to be fair, Becca never was portrayed that positively even in the OG game, but really the other characters at least had sympathetic portrayals the first time around, and for them to be here and seeming to be Carverized, and them just kind of blending in with Carver's group here, and them just having these dickish interactions with these other characters, is really just a disappointing way for these characters to be used here. By the way, we obviously have Clem being able to bond with Bonnie while in the armory, with Bonnie apologizing for lying to her, revealing to her that she was actually in on the plan to leave with Luke, but decided to stay at the last second to help fix the community, claiming that Carver used to be different, obviously being that line that implies that it used to be a peaceful group as implied in 400 Days, though, and the fact that it all changes in a radical degree there is a bit ridiculous, especially considering the fact that it happens over a relatively short amount of time, as this is still only a couple years into the actual zombie apocalypse itself. Anyway, it's after this initial conversation that Tavia then arrives, saying that she has another job for Clem to do, which, why? Why does Clem have multiple jobs to do? Why is she the only one that's being dragged around from place to place? Obviously, again, the answer is because she's the main character and they want her interacting with all these different characters, but it's really stupid. By the way, she's then taken to the greenhouse, where she now works alongside Sarah and having to cut up some plants, to which Sarah is obviously still struggling with coming to terms with Carlos slapping her, to where she's just cowered in the corner and doesn't end up doing any of her work, to where we end up being given the choice here of helping her do her work or just stick to ourselves, which again doesn't really play into anything, as no matter what, one of the batches will be short, either yours or Sarah's, to which Carver will be frustrated anyway, with him being upset at Reggie, who is overseeing them, thus later seeing him literally shove Reggie out of the greenhouse and throwing him to his death. Once again, another moment of Carver really showing him being a menacing villain, but also him stating that his weakness and incompetence will not be tolerated, once again directly connecting him to these authoritarian figures. But anyway, we then are sent back to Bonnie for some reason, where we are then tasked with delivering a bucket of nails to those working on an expansion, which ends up being a shoe store where Kenny and Mike are working. To which, what do you know, that store ends up getting attacked by walkers, leading to a really dumb action sequence. All of it only to lead up to Troy saving Clem here. This leads to Troy feeling the need to babysit Kenny and Mike now, leaving Clem on her own as she heads back, to which she gets pulled into a comic store by a stranger, only for a person who grabbed her turning out to be Luke, who had snuck his way into the compound, though he mentions that guards are watching all the exits and all the holes to escape, which makes you question, then how did you get in? Though this is where we do get the mention of a large herd outside that is larger than any herd that Carver has faced, clearly foreshadowing its role in the story. Though here Luke ends up creating a plan of needing a walkie-talkie that he'll use to figure out the patrol schedules, which we will later go through. But first, Troy ends up catching up to us, to where Troy ends up telling Clem that now Carver wants to talk to her, because again, Clem needs to interact with every character here. To which, this is where we get our Wyatt cameo of him telling Clem that she needs to hurry up as Bill doesn't like to be left waiting, which again just makes him come off as kind of a dick here of him just saying this for no reason. But this does lead to a really interesting conversation with Carver, one that really just highlights how menacing of a villain Carver is and how much he truly believes his own BS, where we instantly enter the room with Rebecca having just left the room, with Carver instantly saying that she's a strong woman but surrounded by weak men and that he won't let his child be raised by that. During which, if Alvin was still alive, we can see him being handcuffed in a chair in the corner of the room, clearly being beaten and unconscious, which shows you the hostility Carver has for him. But here we have Carver talking about Reggie, calling him weak of will and character, and that his screw-ups would put the community in jeopardy, and that he was killing one person in order to save the many. Carver mentioning that it was a decision that weak people are not able to make, and it falls to strong people like himself to make these hard decisions to protect the weak. But again, once again showing that he actually believes that what he's doing is right here, that he believes that he's the only one that can keep this community alive and only one that's able to make the decisions that needs to be made, which adds some new complexity to his character. So following this, we get a bit of a weird interaction here where he does mention that him and Clem are alike, and that Clem has the resilience, courage, and willpower that he has, saying the next generation will need people like her to survive, saying that she was raised the right way and his child will be raised that way so that he will have a person to hand his legacy down to. Again, all this just being really strange in the fact that none of this actually leads to anything. One, it just comes off as this generic, we're not so different, you and I, that these villain characters always spiel, but even beyond that, it really just doesn't matter to anything. It's not like this actually leads into the direct outcome of the season, or really the outcome of Clem's story arc as a whole. It doesn't really end up being followed up on really at all after this episode, to where all this setup of Clem potentially leading the next generation and having this Carver-esque side to her is really just something that doesn't lead to anything. By the way, returning to the pen does have the group discussing how to escape, to which Kenny creates a plan of wanting to draw the herd to the compound and using them to escape, which obviously everyone else opposes to the plan, to which Clem ends up revealing Luke's plan, to which everyone ends up agreeing with that one instead, though eventually they end up agreeing on a mixture of both plans. They need to figure out a way to get through the herd, which is where Jane finally speaks up, and her stating that she gets through herds by covering herself in walker guts, which in doing so, Clem will then mention Lee using this tactic. But first, we obviously still need to get the walkie-talkie for some reason. To be honest, I think this part of the plan is just pretty contrived, of the fact that they need Luke to get the walkie-talkie so that he can tell them when to leave, which couldn't they just wait until the herd is actually just near them, which they should be able to just naturally figure out? And why they need a walkie-talkie just for Luke to tell them all of this. But anyway, this leads to a bit of a heist section here of Jane creating this plan to use a winch in the yard to hoist Clem to the roof, allowing her to sneak into the storage room and take a walkie-talkie, which pretty much goes off without a hitch here, though it is here where we can listen into a conversation that Tavia is having, to which this is where we get the Vince cameo for the episode of him telling Tavia not the smoke, which really just doesn't end up meaning anything of substance. But anyway, the next morning, we have Kenny entrusting Clem with delivering the walkie-talkie to Luke. But first, we have to go to our scheduled job of working with Bonnie, to which Bonnie will imply that she has her doubts about Carver and now wants to work alongside Clem's group, to where Clem can tell Bonnie about Luke's plan, to which she will end up agreeing to help cover for her. Though if you don't end up telling her about the plan, she'll still let Clem go, as she says that she knows Clem is uncomfortable around her and she doesn't want to force her to stay, which again kind of makes no sense, especially considering how much supervision there is in this community. Like, just the notion of her just letting Clem go is just kind of stupid. But no matter what, you're able to execute the plan here, during which you get the Russell cameo, the final 400 Days cameo, which is just one of him guarding the door near the expansion, which doesn't really do anything of substance. Again, what a great farewell to 400 Days there. But that we have Clem entering the comic store, only to find out that Luke is nowhere to be seen, and she gets ambushed by Troy, to where she gets taken back to the pen, where it is revealed that Luke has been captured by Carver, with him knowing about the entire plan and now wants to know who has the other walkie-talkie, to which we obviously have the ability for Clem to then take credit for it, only for, no matter what, Kenny to take the walkie-talkie from her pocket and end up taking the blame himself, once again nullifying that previous choice. Though here we have Kenny handing him the radio, leading to this brutal scene of Carver then viciously beating him with it. Obviously being this brutal beatdown that ends up having lasting effects on Kenny's character moving forward, though also once again presents us with a choice here, as Sarita wants to go and defend Kenny, but Carlos restrains her, and Clem can end up helping restrain Sarita or help Kenny herself, which restraining Sarita obviously just goes as expected, no one gets hurt, though helping Kenny will lead to Clem getting hit by Troy, which leaves a scar on her face that doesn't really do much. While if you do nothing here, or Sarita ends up breaking free from you, then that same thing will happen to her instead, which again doesn't really matter. This is where Bonnie arrives to tell Carver that there's a breach that he needs to take care of, leaving Kenny battered and unconscious in the middle of the room. But this all leads to Bonnie telling the group that she's now in on the plan and that they're leaving tonight. Cutting to a few hours later, where we do have them formulate a plan of getting to the PA system and running it to distract the walkers, while Bonnie will free them, allowing them to escape. However, it is in this moment where Carlos returns to the group, telling them that Kenny has lost function in one of his eyes and mentions that he has suffered brain damage, which obviously is used to further point to how unstable of a figure he ends up being moving down the road. Though here we do have Luke kind of being a dick here and wanting to leave Kenny behind, to which Clem can agree to this, though no matter what, Kenny ends up awakening anyway and ends up agreeing with the plan to leave tonight, with them also creating a meetup spot in a Civil War site named Parker's Run, which we'll see in the next episode. But we once again get this stealth section of Clem having to get back into Carver's office and turn the PA system on, which kind of leads to this tedious task here of turning on the mics and the speakers and having to find a CD. But eventually we do see the group starting to make their escape, where this ends up being the moment where if Alvin is alive, he finally awakens, to which he ends up giving Clem Carver's handgun, and while Clem tries to convince him to try to escape, Alvin instead decides to volunteer and stay back, sacrificing himself, which, I mean, again, he's pretty battered here and probably wouldn't have escaped anyway, though, again, this largely just feels like an excuse to write him out of the story so that they didn't have to bother with him moving forward. Though I do find it really funny that his parting words here are for you to take care of his girls, with him thinking that the baby is a girl, which it's like, it's wrong, so why was this in the game? Unless even the gender of the baby was something that they changed at the last second. But either way, Alvin ends up being shot in the chest by one of Carver's men right before shooting at him as well, which is kind of a dumb death actually. Though either way, Clem will then head back to the stock room, only to then find Carver holding up the group once again, to which Clem can now jump on Carver's back or shoot him with the gun that Alvin gave her, to which she ends up shooting him in the cheek, which is lame, but either way, this will cause Carver to be stunned long enough for Kenny to punch him in the face and Luke to disarm him, holding him at gunpoint, which straight up felt a bit easy in this being the way that they defeat Carver here, but this leads to the debate on whether or not to kill him, though either way, Kenny will decide to shoot Carver in the kneecaps and picks up a crowbar, clearly intending to beat him to death here, while Luke ends up criticizing everyone for letting him do this and says that this isn't right, which, I mean, it isn't, but also it's like, I mean, you're really defending Carver in this situation. I mean, you get some solid parting words here from Carver, where even in his final moments, he really shows himself to be a dick, making comments about the members of the group and calling them lambs being led to slaughter with no shepherd to guide them, still showing him resolute in his convictions. Also, he tries to convince Clem to stay and watch, to which you are given the choice of staying and watching, to which doing so has Carver fully believing that Clem is just like him. And we do get this moment of Clem initially being in shock at Kenny beating him, though eventually that look turns into a cold and unemotional one, which does show the progression of her character, which again, through that does kind of fit in line with what Carver said, though otherwise you can go Sarita and just completely miss out on almost all that. Though this does lead to Sarita saying that this isn't the Kenny that she knows and that he's becoming increasingly unstable, which I wonder if that's going to play a factor moving forward. But either way, once everything's done here, the group ends up exiting the store. They find a herd of walkers in front of them, to which they kill one of them to cover themselves in the walker blood. Before they're able to escape, Troy ends up holding Luke at gunpoint, to which Jane ends up sweet-talking him, convincing him to go along with them at first, only for her to then shoot him in the groin and him getting eaten by a walker, which is a bizarre way for him to go. Anyway, we do start to proceed through the herd as Carver's group is now shooting at the herd, leading to there being a bevy of stray bullets flying around. But here we do have Sarah getting a panic attack, during which Carlos tells Clem to calm her down, which I don't get why Carlos isn't the one calming her down, but that's followed up by him getting shot by one of the stray bullets, leading to him being eaten right in front of them. And it's pretty sorrow death for him. So again, I never really connected much to his character, though this does really come out of nowhere and it's a pretty just sad death, especially considering it's right in front of his daughter, to where Sarah's screams now draw the attention of the other walkers, leading to this bigger action set piece here of the group getting separated and having to kill more walkers. Though in the distance, Clem ends up hearing Sarita crying out for help, which rushing towards her has us seeing her getting bit on the wrist. So Clem is now forced to make a decision that ends the episode of cutting off Sarita's arm or killing the walker, with killing the walker ending the episode on Sarita staring at her bite in horror, while cutting Sarita's arm off has her staring at her bleeding arm, which is a very ridiculous way to end the episode, though in general feels like the way that the episode's meant to be ended, as I feel like it's the one that definitely has the most impact. It was really a choice that seems kind of dumb to make, for you to instantly go for cutting off her arm in a situation where she literally just got bit and you're still in the middle of this massive horde where she could easily just bleed out, and all that feels very rash. But again, overall this ending here is one that I was largely underwhelmed by. I do think it probably would have just been better had the episode ended after they had escaped, instead of again just being in the middle of all the action, with this just coming off as a really over-the-top ending to what is overall a pretty solid episode. Again, a really focused episode, and one that I did enjoy for the most part. It is one of my favorite episodes in the series, especially my favorite one outside of season 1. And a lot of that has to do with how focused of a story it is, how much it focuses on you having to take down Carver, and also Carver being set up as this menacing villain, and one that really holds to his convictions. It does end up boosting this episode quite a bit. So despite my issues with the ending here, it still ends up being a pretty great episode all around. But with that, we move on to episode 4, Amid the Ruins, which is really where, for me, the season goes completely downhill. This episode in particular, feeling like it just really meanders around with not much of true substance really happening here, with a lot of it just feeling like a lot of setup to storylines that I didn't particularly like, while also setting up some really unlikable characters that we end up meeting along the way. But episode starts here directly coming off of the previous choice, where the opening can be different based on which choice you end up making. If Clem does cut off Sarita's arm, Kenny obviously ends up rushing towards her, though she ends up bleeding out and dying from her wounds, having Kenny lash out at Clem here, blaming her for Sarita's death, while if Clem had killed the walker, Sarita will survive for a bit, though she still doesn't play any real role in the episode, and Kenny will end up denying that she's been bit and talk about how she's fine, which really shows you his state of mind. But following this, either way, you get separated from the rest of the group in the middle of the herd of walkers, to where eventually Rebecca ends up grabbing you, to which both of you end up getting rescued by Jane, with a lot of focus being put on Jane here, with us working alongside her to kill some walkers before escaping, which the focus on Jane in the back portion of this season is just really strange to me, as again, as I said, it feels like the setup throughout the entire season had been this Kenny versus Luke dynamic. Then out of nowhere, they add Jane to this, where they kind of drop Luke for Jane. Like, I don't get why they decided to go this route. I don't know if it's because they thought it would be more interesting to have this like sisterly figure for Clem, that it would be a better dynamic that way than Luke. But again, it's just a decision I don't even understand, especially considering Jane is just such an unlikable character too. One that constantly makes decisions that just make you like her even less, and not even entirely new. She just feels like a retooled version of Molly from season 1, a younger woman that lost her sister and through that becomes a sister figure for Clem, though Jane is just infinitely less sympathetic, with Molly just being a better version of this character despite Molly having so much less focus on her. Either way, we do have the three then walking towards Parker's Run, the location that the group had decided to meet up at. Either way, here we do see Rebecca lagging behind, having contractions, clearly giving birth soon, which sets up what really is the rest of this episode and how most of it comprises of you trying to find a place for Rebecca to give birth at. But reaching Parker's End, we do find Bonnie and Mike alongside Kenny, who is sitting alone, clearly broken from what happened to Sarita, while Nick, Luke, and Sarah have all yet to arrive. Here we will talk to Kenny, and no matter what, Kenny's upset at you because that's this game for you. But if Sarita is already dead, Kenny will be extremely hostile with Clem, again blaming her for Sarita's death, while otherwise he'll blame her for not doing anything, which again feels like the most Telltale thing ever, of them just having a character react to you the exact same way despite the two things that you did to cause that reaction being radically different. But either way, eventually we do go off to look for Luke, Sarah, and Nick alongside Jane, which I don't get why Jane cares enough to look for them, considering she has no connection to them, but whatever. But this obviously leads to this massive bonding section between Clem and Jane, with us getting to know more about Jane's life philosophy and her talking about how it's better to not be in a group and how this current group is cracking and won't last much longer, which is very clear. But this also has Jane opening up about her sister, whose death plays a major role to Jane's character motivations, but just doesn't make her that likable despite that. Anyway, we arrive at a mobile home park where we do find Sarah's glasses and hear her screaming from inside one of the trailers, which makes it clear they're nearby, though it is here where if Nick was saved in episode 2, we find a zombified version of him stuck in a fence, which is just a really underwhelming way for Nick to go, where essentially that choice back in episode 2, again, that determines whether he lives or dies, doesn't have anything of substance to it, where even if he survives that, he doesn't do anything. He's simply just there for episode 3, not really playing a major factor into anything, and then he just simply dies off screen. So again, all that really disappointing outcome to Nick here. But here we do have Jane teaching Clem a new technique on how to kill the walkers, which is clearly trying to set up Jane as, again, the sisterly figure, but also this new role model for her, which I rather them not. It makes it even more ridiculous considering Jane's later actions in the story. But anyway, I get this short puzzle section of us having to lure the walkers away by using the horn of a nearby car and using a corpse to keep the horn on, where we finally reach Luke and Sarah, to where it's revealed that Sarah is stuck in a state of shock, and once the walkers attack the trailer, we have to make a decision on whether to leave Sarah or convince her to leave. Where obviously if you leave her, she will end up dying here, screaming for Clem as the walkers come in, which is just a sad way for her to go, but also just kind of dumb that in her last moment she seems to regret everything. But otherwise, if you convince her to leave, Clem will slap her, which I guess is supposed to mirror that of Carlos's slap, but it's that's dumb that this would bring her out of this state of shock. But either way, she survives, only to then not do anything because that's the season for you. But returning to Parker's Run, we do have Jane revealing that her sister was just like Sarah and that she had to be dragged on until she couldn't do it anymore, which again, the game tries to portray as a sympathetic background for Jane and how you should feel bad for Jane because she lost her sister because her sister gave up. But also it's she gave up on her sister. This is not a sympathetic background. This is essentially her letting her sister die. But anyway, we get talk about Kenny's the only one with experience with childbirth in the past, which is really convenient to where you have to talk to Kenny and convince him to help, to which we do get this great conversation here from Kenny, with him seeming to be a broken man at this point, him talking about how being beaten by Carver and being so close to death felt peaceful. All this clearly having him lose the will to live here, which his search of something to live for really plays into his character motivations moving forward. But anyway, now the group has to look for supplies and shelter for when Rebecca ends up giving birth, to where Jane ends up going to the observation deck while Bonnie and and Mike go to the museum, with us being given the choice of the order of when to do these, though really the order doesn't matter and doesn't really affect anything, which is kind of disappointing, especially coming from something like The Wolf Among Us, which did that really expertly. But anyway, going to the observation deck has Clem finding a safe location for Rebecca to give birth, though it's locked with a padlock, to where eventually Clem does notice a stranger approaching them, and the two end up hiding, only for him to then point his gun at Clem, only for Jane to sneak up on him and disarm him, with him revealing himself to be Arvo, who is another really unlikable character being added to the game here. Another one that, again, the game tries to make sympathetic, which is just so stupid and really plays into why I hate the back half of this season. They try to make these really unlikable characters sympathetic, but just completely fail at doing so. Where here we find out that he has a bag filled with medical supplies, and Clem has the decision of whether or not to take them. A choice that really doesn't matter anyway, as Arvo still hates you no matter what choice you make. But it's funny that after this, Clem ends up leaving without anything getting done here, with us literally leaving with Jane still trying to break the lock, which is just humorous that this entire section has them getting nothing done. Though we do see Luke arriving as we leave, which I wonder what will happen there. But anyway, you're obviously tasked with going to the other location that you didn't go to the first time. So arriving at the museum, we find Bonnie and Mike, who have also not found anything, because everyone's incompetent when Clem's not around. Though here we end up finding a blanket, aka a Confederate coat, which is weird, while also finding a locked room where inside there are 2 water barrels, to where you have the choice of having Clem squeeze through or allowing Bonnie to open the door another way, which if Clem goes through, there obviously is a walker inside that attacks her, because obviously, while otherwise, if Bonnie does it, she hits her head, because that's a choice that mattered. Though to be fair, her hitting her head here explains a lot of dumb decisions she makes moving forward. Anyway, as they leave, they end up finding a raccoon that they chase to kill it for food, only to find out it has a family, to which Clem can express contentment or disappointment at that fact, all of which doesn't matter. Why was this in the game? It's so pointless. Anyway, returning to Parker's Run leads to the end game of the episode, where Rebecca is clearly about to give birth, though obviously we have to have some walkers approaching us, because that's this game, to where we have to escape to the observation deck, during which we see Kenny continuously beat up on a singular walker, and everyone talking about how he's not okay, which, again, who would have guessed? But anyway, we arrive at the deck to find Luke and Jane huddled up, which good for them, I guess. But obviously the attack continues, to where we have to secure the gate, all while Rebecca is giving birth in the background, to where we end up using a cannon, only for the cannon's weight to cause the deck to collapse, to which Jane and Sarah topple over, to where we can ask Jane to help out Sarah, though really it's a choice that doesn't matter, as no matter what, Sarah will be trapped under some rubble and die here anyway, which makes us saving her earlier completely pointless, as she literally does nothing in between those 2 scenes. But a section does end with Clem cutting down a cable that causes the rest of the deck to collapse, ending the walker threat, to where we return to Rebecca to find Kenny holding a lifeless body, obviously being this dumb fake out that the baby didn't survive, only for it to then start coughing and breathing, which was dumb. This is obviously the birth of AJ, a major character for future seasons, and also a major character motivation for Clem and Kenny moving forward. Anyway, we then cut to nighttime, where Clem talks to Rebecca, where we can accept or decline to hold the baby. Both choices don't matter, but we end up seeing Kenny looking over the child overnight, which clearly shows him finding this new purpose and raising this new child, him finding a reason to live, giving him a chance for redemption after his previous failures, and through that ends up being a test of how far he will go to keep AJ alive. But it's also here where we notice that Jane is trying to leave the group, saying that Sarah's death reminded her too much of her sister, and she doesn't want the same thing to happen to Clem, despite the fact that she's leaving Clem behind, which means that really all she cares about is her personally not feeling the hurt of losing a sister figure again, not actually caring about the actual sister figure. As you can literally ask to go along with Jane and she will end up refusing you, which is all really stupid, and again just makes her even more of an unlikable character. But following this, we do get a bit of a debate between Luke and Kenny, or it's another one of these choices that make it feel like you're picking a side over the other, though it really doesn't matter at all, of picking whether to leave in the morning or to give Rebecca more time to rest, to which they for some reason give Clem the final say on this, which makes no sense, and also, again, it doesn't affect anything, as no matter what, the next scene that we see is us heading northwards anyway, to where Rebecca collapses no matter how much time you give her, to which we do have Kenny and Luke arguing again, until Arvo reappears in the story here, arriving alongside 3 other Russians who hold the group up at gunpoint, which really just shows you how much Arvo sucks. Being this massive standoff here to where in the middle of it, Clem ends up hearing some walker noises from behind her, realizing that Rebecca has died and has become zombified already somehow. Again, that was extremely quick. She still has the baby in her arms, to where Clem has the choice now of shooting her or calling out to Kenny, who will shoot her for him, which is the end of the episode. A really lame ending to the episode, especially when that's the penultimate episode. Again, comparing this to the reveal of the stranger from episode 4 of season 1 is just embarrassing. Like, this is just such a nothing ending to the episode, one that doesn't even really tell you what the final episode is even going to be. It just, again, feels like this massive unfocused mess of a story, with this entire episode really just feeling like it's meandering about, with a lot of it being focused on the character of Jane, simply because they made this decision to make Jane this final foil for Kenny instead of Luke, which made them have to reset up a whole bunch of dynamics in this episode, which makes a lot of the story beforehand feel almost entirely pointless. Either way, we got the final episode here, episode 5, No Going Back. A complete mess of a conclusion to the season, feeling like it goes against all that setup from the early portions of the season, and really just having an underwhelming outcome for most characters involved here. Though, once again, continuing off of the last episode, we have both sides shooting at each other. We have the choice from Clem of saving the baby or running to cover, which running to cover will have Luke realizing the baby's in danger and him going to save it, to which he gets shot along the way, while otherwise Clem will get the baby unharmed somehow, and Luke will then still get his leg shot, which is all really stupid. But here we have Kenny taking Arvo hostage, threatening to kill him, to which our group is angry at him for some reason, which is just so stupid. Like, again, it really just makes you feel like the writers tried so hard to make you think that Arvo didn't suck when he does really suck. It's like, why aren't we killing him? Why is it bad to be threatening him when literally his family is attacking us in this moment? Like, it really just feels like this moment of them trying to make you question Kenny's morality, but doing it in an extremely contrived way. By the way, the conflict does conclude here with Jane coming to the rescue. Thank God she came back, which it's definitely not awkward after she had previously abandoned us. But also, we have Jane's reaction as being really strange, and her saying that she's never killed someone that she didn't know or wronged her in some way, which is like, these people were attacking your group. But afterwards, with Arvo now being the only survivor, we have Kenny being upset at him, beginning to hit him, only to be stopped by Luke and Mike, who defend him for some reason, talking about how he's not a threat, which, I mean, sure, I guess. I mean, he did literally just lead an ambush against us. But again, to me, it's just so weird, the characterization of really the rest of the group in this situation of supporting Arvo. Where, why? Why do they care about Arvo? Why aren't we killing Arvo? Again, Arvo literally just tried to kill us. Why are we trusting Arvo in this situation? It's so weird, as we literally spent a good chunk of this episode following Arvo's lead of him talking about how he has a shelter and some food that he'll take us to, which, why? Why are we trusting him? Again, just feels extremely contrived. But anyway, on the way there, we have Jane apologizing to Clem for leaving and talks about her concerns of Kenny's mental health, which I wonder if that's going to play a factor moving forward. Also here, we get Luke expressing guilt over him being the last of the cabin survivors left, which is really strange when you contextualize it, that all the characters that we met in episode 1 at this point are now dead outside of Luke, who is about to die, which makes you question what was the point of all of it. I mean, again, like, I understand the dark tone of it all, and it really just shows how much loss there is along the way. But Luke even saying himself that he thinks the others died in vain, where it's like, yeah, they died in vain of a good story, because all this just makes you not really care about a lot of what's going on here and a lot of these characters, considering how in and out they are of the story. But here we also get a nice moment between Clem and Kenny, where Clem is told to clean Kenny's wound, or we get this shot of him without the eye patch. Well, also through this, we end up naming the kid Alvin Jr., which again we later nickname AJ, which is a nice little moment there. Though it's also here where we do get a scene of Kenny being upset at Arvo and beating him up, because that's a thing that happens a lot in this episode. But following this, we have the group spending a night at an abandoned power station, to where the group ends up staying by a fire outside of Jane, who stands off by herself, to where this ends up being a pretty nice moment of levity for the group. Again, being one of the few moments of levity in the entire game, of the group just reminiscing about their previous lives, and Luke revealing that it's his birthday, and them drinking around the fire, and all this is a really nice moment with the group here. Either way, Kenny ends up going on watch with AJ, though Clem is then tasked with convincing the other two to go to the fire, which makes you question why'd he go on watch to begin with. But really, at the end of the day, this ends up being a way for you to talk to the two characters that you're obviously going to make a major choice between at the end of the episode. Now, Jane's conversation here ends up being pretty mundane, though Kenny's conversation here ends up being another nice moment for him, and him finally apologizing to Clem about how he treated her after Sarita's death, but also talks about his regrets from raising Duck and sets up his redemption story of him wanting to raise AJ in a better way. But returning to fire, we do have Mike instantly talking about feeling bad for Arvo and goes to offer him a drink, to which Arvo yells at him to tell him to leave him alone, which again, if Kenny was not convinced to go back to the group, Kenny will then go and beat him up. While if he was convinced to go to the fire, he leaves him alone for some reason. Again, all of this really stupid. Anyway, the following morning, we have them finally arriving at the location Arvo is taking them to, an unfinished house on the other side of a frozen lake, in a position where Arvo says the ice is thick enough for them to cross, to which, what do you know, it's not. And also to add more danger to this, we obviously have walkers following them, which obviously always happens. But anyway, the big moment that ends up happening here is Luke standing above a cracked patch, to which he ends up falling through, with Bonnie wanting Clem to jump in and help Luke, though Luke telling her to just cover him, to which we are given the choice of helping him or covering him. Helping Luke here leads to both being pulled into the water, to where Clem ends up banging on the ice to get back up, to which a walker somehow grabs her onto her leg, which I don't get how it did that underwater, to where Luke ends up rescuing her, only for him to drown himself, which I do think is probably the better outcome for Luke here. Again, this heroic death for him, while otherwise covering Luke, we'll have Bonnie go instead, and both of them fall through as well, to where we'll see Luke banging on the ice, being unable to break it, or you can try to save him, and in doing so, Bonnie will end up surviving this. So if you don't try to save him, Bonnie will die also, which is a weird, arbitrary choice there. But really, I mean, we should just talk overall about Luke's death here, which is just, as a whole, underwhelming. It's like, well, yes, one of these outcomes is better than the other. They're both bad for Luke to die in this way, and for him to die this early on in the story. Again, it just feels like this very clear rewrite, as it just feels so strange that he was supposed to be this rival figure for Kenny, and then he just dies anticlimactically in the middle of the lake here. I know some people claim that the Luke and Kenny rivalry wouldn't have worked out anyway, as Luke was too much of a pacifist in comparison to Jane, who's obviously this manipulative figure, and through that ends up being a better rival for Kenny. And while that might have been the writer's rationale for this sudden change here, I do feel like it is a change for the worse. I think it takes away a lot of the importance of the early portions of the season, being the last of the cabin survivors to now die, which again just makes the first 2 episodes of the season that were largely revolved around that group feel kind of pointless at this point. And again, just making this story feel even more disjointed and how irrelevant the early episodes were to the grander story. Now again, I know there are supporters of Jane being a better antagonist for Kenny than Luke, though I do feel like as a whole, it seems like a very rash decision in my mind, one that would have been fine if they had properly set up Jane as this foil for Kenny from earlier on, though with their rivalry really only just showing up in this episode, in comparison to his conflict with Luke, which has been there since episode 2. I do feel like as a whole, the loss of this dynamic as part of the endgame ends up being a major loss for this season. But anyway, we have the group finally arriving at the unfinished house, to where Kenny blames Arvo for Luke's death, to which Arvo finally reaches his breaking point, only for Kenny to beat him up once again, to which Clem is now given a decision on what to do. She can intervene, which leads to Kenny stopping and accidentally hitting her instead, which he's shocked by. You can obviously just ask him to stop, to which he ends up stopping, though you can also do nothing or ask Mike to stop Kenny, which obviously leads to Mike stopping Kenny, where at this point Mike is brought up as this massive protector figure for Arvo for like no reason. It's never explained why Mike has this liking for Arvo and that he's going so far out of his way to protect Arvo. It doesn't really even match with his character up to this point either, as he's never really portrayed as this caring, protective guy. So all of it is just really strange how they characterize Mike here. But also, to add into the heavy-handed nature of all this, we have Jane revealing that there are a bunch of supplies in the house, to reveal that Arvo wasn't lying and that leads to Kenny being criticized for beating up Arvo for no reason, and all this is just really stupid and really heavy-handed. But following this, we do have Kenny asking for Clem's help in fixing a truck, which feels somewhat reminiscent to the boat situation from season 1. But during this, we do see Jane watching over AJ, to which Kenny clearly distrusts her, which ends up being really the first major point in the story that this Kenny-Jane rivalry is properly set up between the two, which again is so funny considering we're almost at the end. But anyway, this is where Kenny finally re-mentions Wellington for the first time in a while, setting that up as his end goal here. Also here we can have a conversation with Bonnie, to where Bonnie can just end up being a dick here for no reason, being upset at Clem for Luke's death if you didn't choose to help Luke, which feels like this massive negative turn for a character, and it's just really strange that they took away this older sister role from her and gave it to Jane. Again, where in episode 3 at the time, she was being propped up as this sympathetic, loving person, yet now we get to this episode and she just hates Clem and later plans on abandoning her, and it's all just a really strange turn for a character. Again, another situation of it feeling like a very clear rewrite due to the fact that they really wanted to shoehorn Jane's character into all this. But anyway, we then have a conversation with Jane to mirror that of Kenny's, where she talks about Kenny as a clear threat to the group and parallels him and Carver, which, again, those parallels are there to a degree, and Kenny being this very controlling person. And again, it very much feels in line with what the initial plan was for Kenny and him being this Carver-style figure, though obviously on a much lesser scale here. Though I think a major difference here is that Kenny very clearly listens to Clem. It's not like Kenny is this raging lunatic that doesn't listen to anybody. He clearly has this trust for Clem and this care for AJ that I think humanizes him in a way that it feels like the story doesn't really want you to feel. Though we do also funnily have Jane literally saying that you have to decide on what to do with Kenny in the near future, which is just a very clear setup to the future choice. But here we once again have Kenny proclaiming to everyone else about his plan to go to Wellington, to which they're all upset by this and want to go back to the hardware store for some reason. Again, it just feeling like another moment of them disagreeing with Kenny for the sake of it. Well, also, he talks about wanting to leave Arvo behind, something that Mike gets extremely upset about, which it's like, why? Why do you care about Arvo? Who cares, dude? I mean, we're leaving him behind. We're not even killing him. It's like, why do you care about Arvo? And this downward trajectory for the story continues on, where we have Clem waking up in the middle of the night, hearing some weird noises outside, where she goes outside to find Mike attempting to steal the truck alongside Arvo, planning to abandon the group here. To whereas during this, that Arvo will point his gun at Clem, to which it becomes a bit of a standoff. And also Bonnie will later show up, revealing that she's also part of this plan because they need to write her out of the story. Also, it sees them taking a lot of the group's supplies. Again, all for Arvo. Though it is funny that there is an option here of Clem literally asking if she can go with them, to which they just don't accept for some reason, which is so stupid. But Mike talks about leaving because of Kenny and fearing what he could do, to which we are then given the choice of threatening Mike or giving him our gun peacefully. To which originally there was going to be an option here for you to kill Mike, something that actually does appear in the original PS3 version of the game that was later patched out, which I don't get why, as it really doesn't affect anything. I mean, either way, Mike is written out of the story, so I don't get why they just didn't leave that option there. But no matter what you choose here, Arvo ends up shooting Clem in the shoulder anyway, because that's Arvo for you. And this leads to Kenny end up barging out of the house in that moment, to where Bonnie, Mike, and Arvo end up escaping on foot. Again, just being a very strange sequence of events here, being this really negative turn for both Mike and Bonnie, making them pretty unlikable characters by the end of it, while also keeping Arvo as this unlikable character, despite the fact that they continuously try to make you like him when there's nothing to like him for. It's also funny that they're leaving AJ behind, which is weird. They're scared of Kenny, but they're willing to let him still keep the kid. Anyway, this section ends with Clementine passing out, to which we then get a flashback/dream sequence going back to season 1, where we have a conversation between Clem and Lee, bringing back Dave Fennoy for the role, which is pretty nice to see. Well, this will be a scene taking place in the middle of episode 3, where all they're traveling in the RV after the death of Doug or Carly, to which Lee will say that people don't always make sense and how anger and grief could cloud a person's judgment, which my initial instinct is, oh, he's talking about the dumb decision that Bonnie and Mike made about Arvo, but no, he's actually meaning Kenny, because that's how the story's written here. That also ends up saying that part of growing up is doing what's best for the people you care about, even if sometimes that means hurting someone else. Again, a clear line to set up the later decision of whether or not to kill Kenny, with again it feeling like the story wants you to kill Kenny, which is just so weird to me. But beyond that, I will also say this scene does largely feel superfluous. I don't feel like this scene is really necessary at all. I mean, while Lee does mention some things that do end up playing into the final choice in the game, it also feels just unnecessary. It feels like a moment that's here simply because they want the fan service of having Lee in the story once again, as otherwise it's essentially just Lee just blatantly saying the themes of the story to you. But anyway, Clem awakens in the back seat of the truck as Kenny is riding alongside Jane and AJ, which I will say, like, I don't get why Kenny even decided to take Jane along in this situation, considering his distrust of her. But either way, we see them arguing over where to go, with Kenny still wanting to go to Wellington, while Jane continuously provokes him, bringing up personal information and bringing in his family. Though eventually the group gets stopped by a pileup of cars blocking the road, to which Kenny ends up going to a rest area looking for fuel, while have a conversation with Jane wanting to abandon Kenny in this situation. Though all this is obviously interrupted by more walkers, which ends up leading to the truck crashing and Jane escaping with AJ, for some reason leaving Clem behind for Clem to fight against some walkers, which is all really stupid. This obviously leaves Clem alone now for her to walk through the blizzard on her own, but we end up arriving at the rest area where we do find Kenny, who is freaking out over where AJ is, to which we immediately go searching, only for Jane to then end up arriving without AJ and not telling Kenny what happened to him. And when Kenny goes rushing out to search for him, Jane ends up instantly changing her demeanor, telling Clem to stay out of the future conflict, and says that she wants to show Clem who Kenny really is, which all this is really stupid and really just showing you how manipulative Jane is. Well, even beyond that, I don't get what she's trying to prove, as this is really just showing even more what Kenny will do to protect those he loves. It's showing him having true care for AJ and for Clem, to where if anything happens to them, he will be upset and will be willing to kill people, which, considering his role as a protector here and the fact that we're in the middle of a zombie apocalypse, is not the worst thing in the world. Like, I really don't get why the overall story tries to really demonize Kenny in this situation when he clearly has love for both Clem and AJ. But anyway, Kenny will then return pissed at Jane, to where Clem can protect Jane, though Kenny will push her out of the way either way, end up causing a fight between the two, accusing her of killing AJ, which Jane will claim was an accident, and the two will end up fighting to the death, where now we are given the major ending decision of the game, where Clem ends up noticing a gun to the side, and we are given the choice now of trying to intervene or stay put and watching, as we do see Kenny getting the upper hand in the fight, holding a knife to Jane's neck, with Clem having the choice of whether or not to shoot Kenny. A major choice that obviously determines the endings, essentially having you pick between Kenny and Jane. Now, I believe originally the plan was to have Jane actually be the one to have the upper hand against Kenny, though when playtesting the game, they had most of the people picking Kenny over Jane, so they decided to swap the placements. Again, it makes it feel like the story really is written in a way that's meant for you to kill Kenny. It feels like that was the developer's intention here, in them having this character from season 1 in Kenny, someone that was a fan favorite, and bring him back to show his descent into madness, and then having the player have to kill him at the end. Again, a concept that I do think is great on paper, however, I think they really botched the execution. I really feel like when you actually properly think through all the events that are currently happening, all the justifications for killing Kenny feel extremely contrived. It feels like a lot of the characters around him are simply not giving him the time of day, really brushing him off as this insane person with every decision he makes, and through that, it feels like every character is trying to provoke him in this story. Again, it just really feels like the developers were so gung-ho on this final decision on whether or not to kill Kenny that it feels like they really tried to force ways to make the player question Kenny's morality when it simply just isn't properly executed, with not a lot of it making sense. And once again, this entire scene also has a lot less impact when it's Kenny versus Jane. Jane, a character that doesn't come off as sympathetic throughout the entire story, where again, it would have been much better if it was Kenny versus Luke. Luke, a character that was sympathetic and that was a likable figure, one that had this true brother-sister bond with Clem and also showed this direct dichotomy to Kenny, while Jane simply doesn't, which makes the entire choice feel even more pointless. But anyway, we get to the actual endings where shooting Kenny here will have Clem tearfully shooting him in the chest, where even in his final words, Kenny is still loving of Clem here, telling her that she did the right thing and admits to himself that he let people down and that despite him asking for death earlier in the story, he's now scared of it, being this very emotional farewell to his character, though actually probably being one of the better outcomes for his character considering what happens in season 3. Though it's in this moment where Clem will hear AJ crying, revealing that this was all a plot from Jane to provoke Kenny to lash out, making it now even more apparent that Kenny's death was entirely avoidable, which makes Jane even more unlikable of a character. Though it is in this moment where Clem can decide on whether or not to forgive Jane, which leads to different branches of the ending as well, where if she forgives Jane, we then cut to 9 days later where Clem, Jane, and AJ arrive at the hardware store to find it abandoned, though finding some baby formula, which feels very convenient, alongside some other supplies, and the greenhouse still in good condition, implying that they could rebuild a community. Though, following this, we then notice a family of 3 approaching them, with them claiming that they've been looking for food for weeks, to which Jane will claim that there's not any food left, giving us this final choice here and allowing them in or shutting them out. Allowing them in has Jane questioning your choice, even though the people do come off as friendly here, though they do notice that the guy has a gun in his back pocket, which I guess is supposed to indicate danger, though otherwise you can reject the group, with Clem claiming that they have to look out for themselves. This has Jane saying that they might return, to which Clem says they'll be ready. All a really terrible ending here, though there's also another really bad ending in the situation where you don't forgive Jane, or even a later situation where you can't abandon Kenny even though you save him later on, where in doing so Clem will leave alone with AJ, which in the Kenny outcome in particular, I don't get why Kenny allows her to leave with AJ. Like, that's kind of dumb, but either way, you then cut 9 days later to find Clem walking through some plains with AJ in her arms, only to be spotted by a walker herd, to where she ends up covering herself in AJ and walker guts as she walks through it. Again, a really bad ending also. Now, I will say the only minor positive of this and even the previous endings is the fact that they do technically call back to advice that Lee had given her earlier, still playing off of Lee being this mentor figure for her, but I still never found any of these outcomes to be particularly satisfying. Now, originally there was going to be another ending to the game, one that is even more dark, in that if Clem was alone with AJ, they would have Clem walking through a blizzard, only for her to see a light in the distance, but struggle to be carrying AJ, to which you have a choice of abandoning AJ, or literally sitting down and freezing to death, which is a bizarre ending to the game, but one that actually would have been kind of interesting to have there, as it would have had them literally killing off Clementine in season 2, but really a decision that, not a surprise they took that out of the game. Though obviously the other branch of endings ends up involving not shooting Kenny, to which Kenny will succeed in stabbing Jane to death, though after the fact Clem will get another choice of being able to kill Kenny, or also just calling him too dangerous and leaving him, which again gives you the alone endings, though otherwise you obviously end up with Kenny here, to where they end up hearing AJ crying, and end up traveling together, to where 9 days later they end up walking up a hill to find a gigantic wall, which ends up being the entrance to Wellington, which again feels like the most satisfying narrative ending to the story is for them to finally reach this location that was referenced to back in episode 1, where it is here where a woman will stop them and ask them questions, to which Clem can ask if Krista is there, but obviously she's not. But the woman reveals herself to be Edith, and reveals that Wellington is not accepting new members at the time, and instead drops them a bag of supplies to help them on the way, to which is in this moment where Kenny ends up begging her to take just the kids, essentially being a moment of him being willing to sacrifice himself to redeem himself, to make sure that Clem and AJ have these peaceful lives, which, spoiler, they will not, which also ends up minimizing this choice as well. But also, it's really dumb that Edith accepts this. Like, it makes no sense of why are they willing to take in 2 kids but not willing to take in Kenny in this situation. They're okay with splitting up this family but also just not being willing to take in one other person. It is really stupid, though it is a nice moment for Kenny, again kind of being the opposite of the Last of Us ending, in Kenny being willing to separate himself from Clem and AJ for the greater good, and in this Kenny also finding redemption for himself, even though again it's minimized later on. But this is where we get to the final decision of this ending, where Clem will now be given the choice of sticking with Kenny or staying at Wellington, where sticking with Kenny has Edith giving them a second bag of supplies for some reason. Again, isn't that just wasting supplies the entire reason why you're not allowing more people to be added to the community? But anyway, tells them to check back in a couple months, a line that is never followed up on. But here we have Kenny telling her that she's as stubborn as a damn mule, to where Clem will say, I wonder where I got that from, and then walking off into the distance together. An ending that is fine. I mean, I don't love it in the fact that I do feel like it very much leans into this Clem-Kenny relationship as if it's more important than the Clem and Lee one. While otherwise, the ending of staying in Wellington gives us this pretty sorrow farewell between Kenny and Clem, with Kenny telling her to tell AJ of all the people that sacrificed themselves to keep him safe, and hands off his hat to Clem for her to give to AJ when he grows up, saying that he was glad to have met Clementine, leaving off the story in a moment where Clem and AJ enter the community while Kenny walks away as the door shut. I think probably the better thematic ending to me. Now again, there are some dumb plot conveniences here, particularly in why aren't they allowing Kenny in, but still letting Clem and AJ. Again, that is really stupid, but I do think it is this nice moment for Kenny. Again, him having this redemption, him essentially sacrificing himself to guarantee the safety of Clem and AJ, while also not putting too much focus into the Clem-Kenny relationship in a way that I feel like really satisfies the story of the season, while also still not minimizing the story of season 1. So again, I do feel like this is the best ending of the bunch, but that's not really saying much. I do think most of the endings here are just kind of lackluster, where only the Wellington endings are somewhat decent, and this one's just kind of okay, where none of them really have this impact that the season 1 ending obviously has on you. The sorrow farewell to Kenny is probably the closest you get to it here. But with that, that is the entirety of season 2 of The Walking Dead Telltale. A game that, again, I'm still extremely mixed on, with its narrative just being extremely unfocused, having a lack of likable characters, and a lack of choices that feel like they actually matter, even to a minor degree. Where outside of the likes of Clem, Kenny, and maybe Luke, I feel like the rest of the characters here just kind of suck or are really underdeveloped. So much of its narrative feels extremely contrived, and also is just formatted really strangely, to where, while I still do think episodes 2 and 3 are both really strong episodes, episodes 4 and 5 are still a complete disaster, with it feeling like it's really trying to force you to side against Kenny in favor of these really unlikable characters, which ends up making the outcome to this season extremely underwhelming, while also just a complete disappointment coming after season 1, feeling like a story that was completely unnecessary, one that didn't need to be told. Though obviously later seasons have that issue to an even further degree. Now again, there are aspects of this I do respect. I do kind of like the aspect of this being nothing but a downward trajectory for the characters, even though again I do wish most of the characters were handled a bit better. I do think it gives us the best villain in the history of the series in Carver, while also I think again the characterization of Clementine and Kenny is really strong, but it's simply just not as good as season 1, and really just ends up being a mostly passable story, which is obviously just underwhelming comparing to how strong season 1 ended up being. But with that, those are my thoughts on The Walking Dead Season 2. Now, moving forward, I will continue to do Telltale retrospectives on their respective anniversaries. Now, obviously, if I do that, that means I have to wait about 3 years for a new frontier. So, don't know if 100% I'll be actually waiting that long to do that video. Though, obviously, from a Telltale perspective, there is Tales from Borderlands, Game of Thrones, Walking Dead Michonne, Batman Telltale that comes out in between these two games that I'll probably end up doing videos for those games at some point down the road. So again, there'll still be enough Telltale content to make along the way. So stay tuned on videos on those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.